Alright, so the main goal of today is we really want to go through our shoulder anatomy, and we'll go through basic anatomy. We're going to go through exactly what are our primary objectives with shoulder training. So certainly we're all conscious of shoulder exercises, and we understand the role of hypertrophy, building muscle, strengthening, but in terms of what our exercises are and what they actually do, we're going to go through that. We're going to go into a little bit more of the advanced stuff as well. So, when we're looking at movement of the shoulder, how does it differ from a press to a flexion position to an involved movement? So, for example, a shoulder press is one movement, a flexion, whether it's angular flexion, is one movement, or we've got involved protraction and retraction. So it's not the actual shoulder joint itself moving, it's the clavicular joint, so it's slightly different. First off, I'm going to use a little bit of technology just to go through the shoulder joint. This should be way back when we did our Cert 4. Everyone should be on top of this. It is pretty simple. With our shoulder, we've got our humeral head and we've got our glenohumeral joint. So the glenofossa up the top there is, it's our ball and socket joint. The ball sits on the very tip of that scapula, and our clavicle is involved in holding that joint together. It's a very free moving joint. Whilst not a full 360-degree joint, it is really close. Our biggest implication here is while we have such a free moving joint, we don't want to apply it with range, with load through its full range. So if we're looking at the joint structure, very simple. If we're looking at our lifting movement, we've got a lot of movement happening both in the ball and in the socket. As it's raising, we can see here the clavicle is actually important in terms of where that holds. Like, we all understand this, right? Our shoulder moves, that's all that's happening. Really simple. Where our connective tissue sits though, we've got this gap here where there needs to be a lot of free movement. And as we go later on into actual movements and understanding that, if there's an enclosure of that gap, especially if that's muscular tension or whether it's connective tissue inflammation, whatever's happening there, if there's closure of that joint, that's where we're going to run into problems. Especially, you probably see a lot of boxing people have problems because they're just constantly overusing those joints. People who do a lot of martial arts where there's a lot of drop to the floor, people who overtrain shoulders, I'm sure we've all seen them, they're here 3 days a week overdoing side raises. Now, if we're adding our deep muscle to that, so the stuff that we wouldn't normally kind of be able to see at the surface, we've got our bicep insertions, we've got our supraspinatus and our infraspinatus. There's a lot of mistakes that I think people make is the way they're looking at the shoulder is they really think that all 4 rotator cuffs sit on the back of that shoulder blade. So when I've talked to trainers before, they seem to think that all 4 rotator cuffs sit flat on the back of that, and that's just not the case. Our supraspinatus and our infraspinatus wrap that shoulder blade, so they wrap that scapula in 2 sides. So if we actually look at the inside of that scapula, there we've got our supraspinatus. And this is where the big issue is. If we don't have correct activation of these, we've got one, and as you can see, it's quite a big, thick, meaty muscle. People don't give it credit. And then we've got our infraspinatus on the other side, same deal, big muscle. Then when we're looking at our teres minor and our subscap, again, they're going to act as smaller pulling ones. As a 4, if they're not working together, they're not seeing that joint posture. Then we've got our superficial muscle, so we've got the deltoid that sits over the top. Our deltoid in this instance is our prime mover. So this is the thing that if we're doing overhead movements, if we're applying load, needs to press that. But if we actually don't have the right activation and the right utilage of these muscles underneath first, then we can't even create the right movement. Now we can go into movements as well when we're talking about vectors, so when we're talking about the direction of movement, these really help set that direction. Our rotator cuff muscles set that posture in the right position, incorporated with things like our if I get it in a zoom, our superficial muscles and our erector spinae, our trapezius, our infraspinatus, our levator scap, our scalenes, our rhomboids, our serratus anterior, all combine to that position. Which means then as well, and certainly Cody, you've done a lot of this, when we're looking at those positions, when we talk about things like our thoracic alignment, because there's so much musculature involved there, we might have the perfect motor pattern happening for the shoulder, but if it's not working as a chain, if we're not using all the muscles involved, then we've got big issues, especially if we're talking about someone that perhaps already has some shoulder issues. If we don't have the right muscles working to contribute to support that, we're going to have a big problem. So when Zach comes and talks about dysfunction, this is really what he's going to be looking at is, do we have total involvement or do we have isolated strength with isolated dysfunction? Right, coming into this then, if we're looking at our anatomy, the most common thing that we would see when someone reports shoulder pain, it's probably always going to be that infraspinatus point. So when we look at it, it wraps around. So if I can get it around, the infraspinatus comes from the back of the shoulder blade, wraps around the front, and starts binding to the head of that humerus. So our arm bone, that supraspinatus comes around and wraps on the front. So when we're trying to get a big movement at the shoulder, if we don't have that working properly, we can't set that position. When most people report pain, it can be tension or it can be something wrong happening with that muscle. But to actually make the joint work, if we don't have that happening, then very, very quickly the subscapular and other muscles will pull it in, and because we're actually going to have a raise, so it's going to come up, it's not going to work as effectively. So it's as simple as if we come and look at what most people report, which is an impingement, this is all that's happening. If we go underneath the muscle, there's that gap there, and that's all we're inflaming. We're closing it off. And as it swells, it closes that gap, causes a lot of pain, and that's sitting right on top of the nerves and tendons. Some of the other things that we're likely to see as well, if we've got a bursitis in the shoulder, so this is going to be an overuse injury. So let's zoom in again, coming from the shoulder, going underneath the deltoid, coming up on top of that bursa. It gets so inflamed to the point, so if we had impingement, if we repeatedly push through that, so if we've got a client who goes, oh, my shoulder's a bit sore, and we go, okay, let's just push through it. We go from not just a little bit of inflammation, but now that becomes bursitis, and it comes to the point where we can't push through. Another common one that we're probably going to see is instability. So certainly I would say that in a lot of the people I deal with, and I'm sure you guys would agree, instability is something that we really need to get on top of, because it means that the bone structure itself is not sitting properly. Now this could be from muscular weakness, it could be actual structural instability, as this is indicating, where the ball and socket joint itself aren't even holding properly through. Or it could be something as simple as that, as they're moving through under load, so if we're talking about an overhead press, they're actually not setting that position properly, and the ball is free moving, so that humeral head moves too easily and it moves away from that socket. It's like, let's put it in an analogy, if we're driving our car, if we don't have all the nuts secured on our wheels, the wheel is going to wobble, eventually it's going to either break the wheel or it's going to pull the whole thing off. So it's either a car accident or a severe issue to our car. This is exactly the same. If it's not stable, if it's not supported, we're going to have problems. So going into then our main shoulder exercises, what do you guys think the main ones that we would really consider? So if we're talking about, if we think about training shoulders, what are the most common movements that we do?
Shoulder press, side raise, front raise.
Yep, right, so definitely press. Press is probably our big one. Everyone thinks shoulders, they think shoulder presses. So if we're looking at a press as a breakdown, it's not a movement in itself, it's a combination of a whole lot of things. So for a shoulder press to happen, and these are the studies that I've given you today, for those that are watching online, I'll actually put them up on the notes. The studies I'm giving you are really going through what is the exact kinematic pattern, kinematic being what is the sequence of exercises that are happening at that joint to make a press happen. For that, we're going to have, first off, shoulder retraction. We're going to have some external rotation, we're going to have some posterior tilt, and we're going to have some flexion of that humeral head. So we've really got 3 or 4 different movements happening for that press. So if we don't have strength of all surrounding musculature, let's start with flexion, for example. If we're looking at flexion, we've got that humeral bone coming up in front. Very, very simple movement. Rotator cuffs aren't working properly, we can't achieve that. If we're then looking at a shoulder retraction, very, very simple, just pulling that scapula back. If we've got any issues with our traps or our teres minor or our rhomboids, that's not going to happen properly. We can't achieve a proper press. If we're looking at a slight external rotation, which we're going to have when we're doing a press, if there's any restricted mobility there, we're going to have problems. So, how many people do we see where they've got tight pecs, they're slightly kyphotic, they're not really in a good position posturally, but they want to go and train shoulder presses. So these are all the things that we have to evaluate. And now we're not exercise physiologists here, so we don't get people, shirt off and let's start looking at how you move your joint. We have to be able to do it while we're actually in the process of working with our clients, sometimes in the middle of exercising, in the middle of an exercise. Considerations of what are the different segments of this movement and how is each one working independently of each other can really help us identify, are there any limitations to gaining strength in this exercise? And this is, I would dare say, shoulders are probably the hardest of all the joints to master because we've got so many different angles that we can work with, so many different vectors. Whereas the knee can only go in one range, an elbow can only go in one range, the shoulder can move in such a versatile way. And it can also, if we're strong, we can cheat our way through range of movement under load. It doesn't mean it's productive, but we can cheat our way there. So when we're looking at exercises, shoulder presses, really common. Just let me get it back to the shoulder so we can have something better up on the screen. If we're looking at our shoulder exercises, press is the big one. What are our different kinds of press then? So if we have to break it down, what are our different kinds of shoulder presses?
Military press, push press, arm press,
Okay, so
press.
Military press. And I'm going to put on there a Smith shoulder press. Primary difference between these two, what would we say? One's a stabilised, one's a fixed movement. Traveller bar is fixed, the other is free moving. We're going to have a lot more stabiliser involvement with the military press. We've got a dumbbell shoulder press. A machine.
Neutral press.
Yep. And then we can go into, so assuming that was just the apparatus, we can also look at different grip positions, different raise and ulnar positions relative to those presses. But we've also got to consider what is the vector, so what is the line of travel of our weight for that shoulder. And if we're looking at, for example, a military press, often we're going to have our bench at a slightly reclined position. Same thing for a shoulder. What is our bar path of travel? Is it vertical? Is it at a slight angle?
Slight angle.
Absolutely. So this then changes our body dynamics, our biomechanics, because we're not going to have, if we've got our shoulder joint, if we've got our torso and our hips and our legs, we're not going to have a straight line through the shoulder. We're actually going to have a very slight arc movement as that bar travels. So we've got not only flexion, external rotation, but we've also got a change in the load pattern of that weight. It is not consistent load at every point of the movement. Hence why it travels faster as we reach the peak of the movement and has that really deep, slow part of the movement as we're at the bottom. So we've got to be thinking about, in terms of what we're trying to work with our clients, what are the best exercises for where they're at? If I've got someone who at the moment is not really capable of stabilising load, if we're putting them on a free-moving military press, are we really teaching them how to effectively use that joint and musculature properly, or are we putting them into what is a really difficult movement pattern straight away? Same thing, a dumbbell shoulder. We've got a lot of stability incorporated because now we've got the ability to internally and externally rotate with the elbows. So we've got internal and external rotation capability at the shoulder while the weight's moving above head. So there's some advantages in stability. We've also got the capacity to change our grip angle. So we can change our radial and ulnar position. So if we want to, we can have that pronation or inversion of the wrist and actually work to a better press position. Especially if we've got clients who maybe experience pain in one position. If they're on a barbell military press and they experience pain, a dumbbell shoulder press may start to identify some of these things. They may have overly tight digitorum flexors or something in their forearm where they can't actually get back there without trying to cross across tension, and therefore they try and compensate at the shoulder. Also the angle of a machine, every gym we go to has different machines. In this one alone, we've got 3 different shoulder press machines, all at different angles. And the way the handles travel is some of them are vertical and some move in an arc movement. So they're not the same either, because what's happening in terms of, if we just break it down to skeletal movement, it is a totally different movement at each point. So I'm not really trying to think of, am I just doing a shoulder press? I'm trying to think of, what is this movement for my client? What is the lesson that they're learning in terms of their biomechanics, their strength gains, and how does that then move forward to the next decision? Now, these are what we call, all of these are often on a bench, right? This is what we call closed chain kinetics, or closed kinetic chain, because what we're going to have is in this position, the scapula is fixed onto a bench. By default then, it's going to have a natural anchoring and it's going to have automatic posterior tilt, because the bench, assuming it's at a slight recline, automatically sets up that posterior tilt. We're going to compensate with a little bit of spinal elevation, so we're going to have a little bit of an arch in that back, and it's going to change the angle of that shoulder. What it means is the involvement of our rotator cuffs and of our stabilizers is lessened. So even on something like a dumbbell shoulder press, although we've got the stability of internal-external rotation, we've actually controlled stability of the scapula. So it's a closed chain movement. Compare that then to a barbell press, or a freestanding press, or a stretch press, or a push press, whatever you want to call it, or a jerk. Now we've got no low position, we've got no bench to anchor to, so we've got stability of the scapula and we've got stability of the internal-external rotation to consider. So the involvement of the musculature is a lot more advanced, and as a result as well, the development for that joint is a lot better. But by a certain consideration, this is not a good starting exercise for a beginner. So our exercise selection should really be based on how are the stepping stones in order of each exercise and what they're learning beneficial for this person. So if we were starting with a new person, no injuries, no risks, no further considerations, what would be the order that you guys would put these exercises? If we're just talking about presses, what would be the order? And there's no right answer here, but if we're thinking about what are the lessons they're going to learn at each point, is our primary objective strength gain? To get the joint and the musculature around that joint used to bearing load? If that's the case, well, a fixed angle machine shoulder press is probably going to be our best preference for our first exercise. What if we're then talking about a position where we're going to have a little bit more free travel, but also it's going to be more replicative to working with a barbell? The natural progression might be to go onto a Smith machine shoulder press. Then if we want that to become more of a free moving movement, we might go onto a military press, and then we want to actually start getting a lot more stabilized development, go onto a dumbbell shoulder press. So there's no correct answer other than what is our primary objective in training. If we've got someone and their goal is general well-being, health, and general strength, they're not wanting to be the strongest person in the world, but they definitely want to feel like they're a lot stronger in the gym, we can change all of these decisions. I might then start on a dumbbell shoulder press, because we can actually start working on that stabilizer integration straight away, controlling internal-external rotation. And then, we can actually progress them to the king of all movements. We can move them to a barbell overhead press because we've actually controlled all that. Then we've got to consider in terms of, that's if we're just controlling the shoulder. For a press movement, if we don't have the right mobility of the joint, of the elbow, of the spine, and control of the hip, that whole movement can fall apart. So if we're looking at these studies that I've given you guys, there's two here. The first one is, and disregard that it's geared towards throwing athletes, so baseballers, javelin throwers, shot putters, all the rest. This really goes into the anatomy and physiology of the joint. So everything from the socket itself to the incorporation of the muscles around it. But when we're looking at this, it actually starts to look at what are some of the little dysfunctions that can happen and how does that affect these different movements. Certainly in terms of the outcome of this study, it was really indicative that for all measures of performance, a overhead press has a significant value. And from all the research that we've been digging up over the last week to get prepared for this seminar, every study, as long as someone is pain-free or in a specific rehabilitation program to manage that pain and rectify that pain, overhead pressing has significant value for all athletes. So how many of us make this a priority in our clients' training? We certainly see a lot of people put their clients straight on a bench press, put them straight on a leg press, put them straight on a pull down. But are they giving just as much attention to the shoulder and its movement I would even go so far as to say, especially based on a study that was done in Japan last year, the importance of managing, developing, and actually starting to master overhead press movements has more value than mastering a horizontal press like a bench press, because you have to learn to control that shoulder so much more. As a direct result of improving shoulder press strength, a bench press will go up. If a bench press is improved in strength, it will not necessarily transfer to a shoulder press. So immediately, by learning to actually develop this joint and develop how much we can control it, we're going to have some tricep involvement, we're going to have some stabilizer development. A bench press has to go forward, but it does not work the other way around. So, other than presses, what did you say what else we've got?
Front raise.
Okay, yep. So we've got, and we call these flexion movements, so shoulder flexion. The interesting thing about flexion movements is we have a large degree of capability. So if we're looking at someone's side on, and we've got our shoulder joint, we can move flexion in an arc, we can move flexion laterally to the side, we can move slight flexion anteriorly, posteriorly, any direction you want. So our joint has incredible range for flexion. Front raise, side raise, rear raise. The difference between a side raise and a front raise, we're just talking about the position of that movement. Is it angular inversion? Now, when we're looking at these studies, what we really want to understand is what are the consequences to muscular development, joint stress, and joint stability. So what's the repercussion on our connective tissue from different positions of flexion? A lot of these isolated movements, because a flexion is an isolated movement, if we're using flexion, so let's say we're talking about a barbell front raise. What are the, we understand that yes, the arm is moving out in front of the body, and yes, we're going to use our anterior deltoid and our medial deltoid, but what else is happening? Do we understand what are these rotator cuffs doing? So first off, our infraspinatus, is it retracting? Are we getting posterior tilt at that scapula? Are we getting really good involvement of the serratus anterior to actually lock it down? Are we getting rhomboid activation to stop contraction? Are we then getting good infraspinatus movement to help with that external rotation? There's a lot that needs to happen with those muscles for a front raise to happen. So what seems like such a simple movement actually has far worse repercussions. And what are we looking for in that movement? So Charles, if I get you up for a second, you can be my demonstrator. What we typically look at is the travel of the bar. So if Charles is doing a front raise, so just pretend you're doing a barbell front raise for me, as PTs, we tend to look at what's the travel of the bar. What we need to be thinking about, and it depends on the person, how much body fat they have, what clothing they're wearing, but what's actually happening at this joint. And it's subtle, but can we see is there very slight internal rotation? So just maybe do 10 reps for me. So we can see subtleties, but through a shirt it's hard to gauge. But there's things that we can definitely see. Have we got good posterior tilt of that scapula? So just stand slightly side on so these guys can see as well. Go another 5. Have we got good posterior tilt? If we don't, then we're going to have strain because we're closing that subacromial gap. So that gap between the clavicle and the humeral head is that closing and causing that impingement. Have we got good postural position? Is that thoracic spine being compromised to make that movement happen? What's happening with our elbows? Do we have to hitch and bend to actually get movement or travel, or can we actually achieve a nice straight movement? Little things like that would tell us, is this something that is good for our client or bad for a client? So, a really common one, we see people doing front raises, hitching at the elbow. So we're changing, now we've got what's happening at the shoulder, internal rotation with further travel. We're going to get a slight impingement, see people do it all the time, especially these guys that have got really big deltoids, they've got a lot of power, and they're always pursuing that next big weight. Everything is about the next big load. It's that ego-driven movement. But with that internal rotation, we're changing the dynamic of the lift. We don't have strict flexion anymore. So with internal rotation, we've now got the chance of actually impinging in that subacromial gap. What's likely to cause that? Why might we hitch our elbows, do you think?
Focus on traps though.
Yep, so either,
Too much
we don't have enough stability, we're not actually retraction, or the load's too heavy. We're working with a load that is just far too heavy to work in an arc vector. So they're changing it to, if you watch it, we're changing it from a straight arc to almost like a zigzag up, because it's more of a lift. Yeah, subtle, but if you're looking for it, we can tell what's happening. If we want to assist our clients, we need to be able to correct these things. And it can get really finicky. We don't want to be that trainer that's sitting there going, right, we just want to move 2 degrees to the left. I want you to hold that position. Now I just want you to hold that breath. It's too much. Unless we're working with elite athletes, they don't need that level, but we need to make sure we're not going to injure them. And especially we've got clients who want results now, they want it tomorrow. We want to have really good programming that's going to work around that. And at the same time, we want to be able to see progression. If they're stuck doing 4 kilo dumbbells for the next 6 weeks, they may get mildly frustrated. So our programming considerations have to take into account incorporating these things and working around that, but also being really observant of, for this movement, if I'm using a flexion movement and the angle that I'm trying to achieve, what is happening with my surrounding joints? Another really common one, we see side raises. Side raises can be done all measure of ways. We see them with hitched elbow. We see them done, almost like a scarecrow movement. We see them with wrists hung. Is there a right? Is there a wrong? You've got to be thinking about what's the effect on that joint from my change. So little things. If we change our wrist position, if my wrist is in a fixed position and I've got a straight flexion laterally, is the load neutral or is it changing as I go up? If it's a straight arc, is it the same load all the way up to the top as it is at the bottom? Absolutely. If I now start with a straight wrist, and as I'm getting to the top, I'm letting my wrist relax, I'm letting go of my forearm strength, and my elbows are taking it, then it's not the same load, because as I'm traveling to the top, I'm getting a lot more biceps and brachii involvement to help assist that, rather than actually relying on flexion of the shoulder.
So does that mean swimming weight's too heavy?
Could be too heavy, or it could just be that they're not conscious of what they're doing. Are they able to actually flex that wrist? Are they able to secure that and still achieve the same quality of movement, or do they need to back off? Absolutely. The other limitation we have is, flexion movements, they're often going to be done with lighter weights. Certainly for girls, well, for our smaller girls at least, it's probably a little bit easier because the weight increments that we tend to have on dumbbells are in single kilo denominations. What happens when we start to get to some of our stronger athletes? What do the dumbbells go up by? Yeah, that can be a big jump. We're talking, if you're talking the difference between 10 kilos and 12 and a half, that's a 25% increase in load per arm. That's quite significant. So if you compare 20 kilos, so 10 kilo each hand, 20 kilos load, to now 25% increase in load, we would never go from a 100 kilo squat to a 125 where they're already struggling on 100. But that is our only option with dumbbells. So then, are they actually ready to go that next level? Sometimes perhaps we push our clients too far because we want them to go that next development. We want them to see that progression, but the weights that we have at our disposal are just not affording of that. So we've got to think about other ways. Is there a better way to bridge that gap? In terms of flexion, we've also got our kind of reverse movements, so we can use a little bit of kind of protraction and retraction involved in that. So we're looking at those rear flies, things like that. We've got integration with cable movements, so the shoulder is heavily involved with our chest movements as well, especially if we're doing flies or if we're doing a semi-vertical press like an incline. So we get a lot of opportunity to work different angles and work flexion, but it doesn't always have to be just a front raise, side raise. There's a lot of corrective exercises out there as well, and that's certainly something that Zach will go through in his workshop. But for today, I just want you to think about, if we keep it as simple as our presses and our flexion movements, each one should have a particular line, it should have a particular vector. And if we're correcting it appropriately, we're going to achieve the best results from that. All the research really indicates that the movement that we choose needs to be done properly for that movement. There's no best movement, but whatever one that we do choose needs to be done appropriately. If it's not, we're going to have problems. Really common one we might see as well is the vector, so the line of bar travel for a press is not perfect, it's not vertical. So if we're saying a barbell press, if it's over the head, if we've got the bar and it's traveling on center of gravity, we've got fantastic shoulder action. We've got good external rotation, good posterior tilt, good retraction, good flexion of the shoulder. It's an awesome movement. If we've got slightly forward travel, all we're missing is shoulder retraction posterior tilt. But at the same time, because we've moved away from centre of gravity, that's where we've got that joint instability. The load on that ball, the socket, is all of a sudden really compromised. So two tiny aspects of the movement massively change the vector. And how do we correct that? If we can't teach someone, it's not sometimes as simple to say, make sure the bar stays over your head. Because if we did the same thing, so if we've got that bar travel, and we say bring it over your head, but it's not corrected by retraction and tilt, instead they just bring their hands overhead, now they're actually flexing their spine to bring that bar back. They haven't corrected it, they've just moved the bar in a way that felt kind of easy to do. So now we've compromised the spine to make it look right, but we haven't identified what was the problem with the movement first. So it's very, very hard because what's the average travel time for a shoulder press, do you think? Maybe 2 seconds? Like, it's quite a fast movement. It's a lot easier with a squat where you might say have 2.5, 3 seconds, and you've got a lot further distance of bar travel. It's easier to pick it apart. For a shoulder press, sometimes it's quite short, it's quite fast, and if they do it slow, they do it right, but as soon as they speed up, they do it wrong. So it's much, much, much harder to pick up these things. The easiest way is, if they're doing their warm-ups and we identify it then, that's when we can start picking it apart. Right, going into a few other elements then. I gave them all that to you guys, didn't I? I'll just borrow this one for a second. In terms of then actually thinking about, before we go into programming considerations, in terms of actually correcting muscular imbalances or pattern imbalances with rotator cuffs. So if they're our big four, if the rotator cuffs are our big focus for shoulder stability and shoulder position, and certainly we've got the others, but they're just not as common. But if we're trying to correct imbalances in the rotator cuffs, so for example, let's say we've got really, really good infraspinatus activation, and our subscat is just not doing its job. There's so many different ways and methods out there. So I wanted to be able to leave you guys with a walk away today where you can definitively say, based on current research, this is probably the most effective way to do it. So this article was published in 2004. So it's about 10 years old, 11 years old now. Still, in terms of what I can find, it's still fairly well standard, but because this one's free to download, you guys can access it. It goes through all these different ways of correcting rotator cuff imbalances. There was just your standard pressing movements. There was focused band and resistance work, focused internal, external rotation. How often do we see people sitting there and they're doing that for ages? There's a lot of people, and it's not necessarily a wrong method. It's actually been proven, it's scientifically tested. But can we definitively say, based on research, is this a guaranteed source or solution for you to fix this? And we don't know that. We're not prescriptive, we're not able to deal with injuries in that way. But if we want to help our clients, one thing that we can do is isometric work, isokinetic work, and what that means is if we're looking at actually just, and what they suggest in this one, is getting their client on a rower for 5 minutes and really working on the full proper row pattern, so using the shoulder and the weights intended on a rower, getting that retraction happening. We've got some slight internal rotation, we've got some slight external rotation, we've got some good pull through the rotator cuffs. We need all the muscles to warm up for that to happen, and they just go through different ranges. So it's as simple as actually working the shoulder through the range without load, going crossbody, working on retraction. So they just reckon it's as simple as, go through the shoulder's full range of motion that you can take without pain, without load, work on that for, like 2 or 3 sets of 12, do it nice and slow, think about trying to contract the right muscles that you need to, and if you do that, over time, the imbalances will rectify themselves. If it doesn't, it has a further pathology beyond that, but in terms of what we can do, which is safe, it's prescribable, we're not going to injure our clients by making the wrong decision, it's something as simple as that. And we're going to increase mobility because we're actually working on that. So then it gives us the opportunity as well to incorporate unilateral work. If we want to build up strength, we can go through those isokinetic, isometric movements and actually go through a range, and we can add unilateral work if we want. We can go single presses with dumbbells or kettlebells or band resistant work, and actually start to work on strength in that range unilaterally as well. Does that make sense, guys? So I'll make sure that you guys have the links to these studies. Definitely, they are worth reading for surface value. I wouldn't bother going through the methodology or the results sections. You can pretty simply read the introduction and the discussion, and you'll get what you need to from those studies. Because you don't need to know the apparatus used, you don't need to know the specific definitive angles or degrees of movement that were involved. You just need to know what was the issue, what are we looking for, what's the outcome. So if we're talking programming considerations then, based on that information, if we're training shoulders, we've got a huge array of different athletes and the way in which shoulder training is going to be incorporated. So let's start off, if we've got a person, they train with us 1 day a week. What are we going to do with them? What's our typical training?
Shoulders.
Yeah, shoulders just 1 day a week? No, so if we see someone 1 session a week, we're probably going to train full body.
Full body.
Right? That might be with functional training, maybe with resistance training. So assuming that we're doing some kind of resisted effort, if we're training them 1 day a week, we're likely to do full body. So how much time? Let's say we see them for half an hour. This is worst case scenario. This is the unideal client. We only see them for 1.5 hour a week, and that's the only time they do resisted effort. If we're then training full body, how much time does that really leave us to train shoulders, do you think?
We can integrate movements like thrusters, squat, shoulder press, stuff thing.
Yep, so we can have some compound movements, especially if we've got them to a point where they understand those movements, we can do some squat thrusters. But if we've got a real beginner and we've got to teach them how to actually move their body first, there's a good chance that we might only have 5 minutes to actually train this really comprehensive and difficult joint. And it's going to be a really slow learning curve to get to where we want them to be strong. So in considering that then, what could we do to actually make sure that they're going to use their shoulders in the best way possible? Keeping in mind that they may have some imbalances, my recommendation would be, the first thing we start with is warm-ups, and if we're doing just that simple range of movement stuff and working to actually get in the right angles so there's no load there, actually get the activation of rotator cuffs, then if we want them to learn how to actually work under load, we can go straight back to our presses and then maybe incorporate some light flexion at the end. So it might be something as simple as, so if we've got 1 day a week, we might have some just light warm-ups, and let's say we do 2 sets of 10 on maybe a dumbbell shoulder press, get a little bit of stabilizer involvement, teach them how to actually use their stabilizers to prevent internal and external rotation, and then we might have, say, 2 sets of 12 to 15 on a light flexion movement in one particular angle. So we could have side raises, we could have front raises, we could work on some rear lateral raises, whatever we feel we need to do. We may have some posture things that we want to help correct, so we might use some rear raises in that sense. So there's our 5 minutes. It's not the fastest learning curve. It's not going to result in fantastic hypertrophy, but it's at least something that we've incorporated, and we're not going to leave it out. Too often I think we find we have people who they incorporate a lot of pressing, but not overhead. They go straight to the bench press. What if we've got someone for 2 days? What are we typically going to do? What kind of programming? Yeah, so we've got upper lower splits, we've got push pull. And this is fantastic because when we're likely, assuming worst case scenario again, if we're only seeing them for half an hour, we've at least got maybe say 10 minutes now that we can work on. So again, considering that we've got some simple warm-ups we can do, we're always going to want to incorporate like for like warm-ups as well. If we're doing a dumbbell shoulder press, the easiest way to warm up that movement is do it light. You don't have to go into the most technical warm-ups for a movement. It is as simple as just do the movement with a light weight. But what are some other lessons that we can learn for our presses then? We can change angle, we can change, so a dumbbell shoulder press, we've got unilateral load. We can incorporate, say, a Smith shoulder press where the two get to work together. Especially the way our motor cortex works, in stabilizing 2 independent limbs versus if they're fixed on a bar and working together, the lesson for us neurologically is dramatically different. If we're using a dumbbell shoulder press, it's kind of like, imagine if your car had 2 steering wheels for the front wheels, one for the left, one for the right. If we're driving at speed it is really, really hard to control what one wheel's doing to the other. That's what's happening on dumbbell shoulder press. Our brain, our entire reflex system, what's happening in terms of our muscle spindles, has to be learning how to not let one accelerate above the other. So working in terms of, it's almost two separate contractions controlled in a really harmonious way. Versus if we're on a Smith shoulder press, dominant sides are irrelevant. We don't have to manage that or control that. So there's a lesson there because we can use both. So we can have a fixed bar, we can have a unilateral load, and we can actually develop both. And all of a sudden, the lesson for our clients is far more beneficial because they're going to accelerate at a faster rate. And we can progress those. We can incorporate, say, a dumbbell shoulder press as well as a Smith shoulder press. And then as they get better and better, we may progress that from a, let's say it was a dumbbell shoulder press and Smith shoulder press, we may go on to a free military press afterwards. In terms of, as well, our order of exercises, just be thoughtful of, what is our dependency on stabilizers for this movement. Good example, if we were to go from a Smith shoulder press, and let's say we're doing a Smith shoulder press for max effort for, 5 sets of 10. So we're going to have pretty fatigued musculature at that point. Stabilizers, much smaller muscle groups, are always going to fatigue at a much more accelerated rate than our prime movers. Then we decide we're going to incorporate dumbbell shoulder presses. We've now got a big problem because we're so more reliant on those stabilizers, and yet now we're going into the movement which is much dependent on them. Programming order has to be a real consideration. And now, especially when we're in a gym, especially if we're at peak time, we're also dependent on the availability of equipment, correct? So it may be a matter of, if we're waiting on a Smith machine because we know we need it, but we also want to go dumbbell shoulder presses first, we may have to drag the bench out in front and do dumbbell shoulder presses straight in front of the Smith machine, finish our sets there, drag the bench back in and straight onto the Smith. So that way we've reserved our equipment, we're being useful and thoughtful about our process, and we're not sitting there going, okay, we've just finished dumbbell shoulder press, now we've got to wait another 5 minutes to get on the next machine. You've got to be thinking about exercise order, but also the implication to you running an effective, well-managed session for your client. Right, in terms of 3 days, what are the different things we can do? What are some splits that we can do, guys? 3 days.
Push pull legs.
Say again?
Push pull legs.
Push pull legs, yep. What else?
You do like full body over 3 days.
Yep, so full body repeats.
Yeah.
What else? Any others? So, certainly they're the most common ones, and full body is especially coming back in popularity in 2015, I found. It kind of went away for a little while, but now full body repeat programs are back. I do find that our programming parameters tend to be limited by our notion of just segregating muscle groups. There's also so many more things that we can do. We can control tempo, we can control speed, we can control mobility, we can control vectors. What if we had an entire day which was prime mover focused? So if we're talking about, say, a 3-day program, what if we had one day where it's a standing barbell shoulder press, a squat, and say a bent over row? So we've got 3 big prime mover compound movements. What if we had another day where we've got a one-arm dumbbell row, we've got a shoulder flexion movement, we've got a, say, an incline bench press and maybe a leg extension. So we've got one compound because we haven't trained chest yet, but we've also got 3 much more isolated controlled vector movements. And what if we had a third day where everything's much more about independent limbs? So we might have some lunges, we may have some step-ups, we might have some single arm presses or single arm flexion movements, we may have some push-ups, we might have, or even say independent limb, we can do a rolling medicine ball push-up. We can control so many more things than just the segregation of muscle groups. At the end of the day, we just got to be thinking about what's the programming for where my athlete is, what weaknesses am I targeting, and when I say athlete, I basically mean client. What is my client wanting to achieve? And based on where their weaknesses are, how are we targeting them and progressing them towards it? So, sometimes training full body 3 times can be really beneficial, But we can't go in and do max effort shoulder presses 3 times a week. The joint won't take it, the connective tissue won't take it, the muscle won't take it, but we can certainly use our shoulder 3 times a week. We've just got to be thinking, what's the number of sets here? What's my best position for putting maximum effort in? Is it the end of the week? Is it the start of the week? What are the actual rest days? If we've got a client and they're training full body, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday maybe isn't going to work the best, But if that's all they've got, there's still definitely parameters that we can work around that. So
you could find the same training each time, just altering the rep range, just to have a heavy
absolutely.
knee, light.
Yeah, totally. Stacked rep patterns work awesomely. And volume replacement patterns. So you may have 3 sets of 6, so we've got a total of 18 reps. You can break that down into also 9 sets of 2. You can break that down into, you can do the same load with different rep patterns, different rest period, and achieve different outcomes. You can focus on velocity. It's something, without deviating too much, there's a lot that we can do in 3-day splits other than just going push-pull legs or, chest back, shoulders leg, bis and tris. There's really, I think bodybuilding has a lot to answer for in terms of really kind of funneling us into these narrow programming structures. It all comes down to what's the benefit for the athlete. Really good example, before I get off track, Shaco, this great program, it's proven incredible results in strength gains. And some of those programs have athletes squatting 4 times a week for up to 26 sets. We're talking way over your normal volume, but it's got a proven record of strength development. So it doesn't match the science that we typically think of, but it does work. So there is opportunities to just get away from those fixed patterns and use more repetitive volume in the right way. You don't have to, if you're doing a press on a Monday, so let's say we are doing a shoulder press on a Monday, you can do a shoulder press on a Wednesday because you might do some light speed work on a Monday, and then as we're actually reaching that peak recovery point with that super threshold compensation, all of a sudden now we can go into some max effort load work. You can have lessons carry from one day into the next. Especially familiarity and acclimatization to load is a big thing with people. If we want someone to be able to get under, let's say it's a fairly big guy and he wants to get under a 100 kilo military press. If he's not experienced load on the shoulders for 7 days, his first experience, even through his warm-up, is going to feel heavy. If he did some lighter speed work on Monday and he's coming back on a Wednesday or Thursday and he's now doing some max effort heavier work, then it's going to actually feel a lot lighter because his experience is in such close proximity that it's not going to feel as heavy. So that in itself is going to help overcome that fight or flight response. That peripheral nervous system is not going to be, the sympathetic nervous system is not going to be so reactive to the load. It's far more likely to perform a lot better. And there's where Shaco and programs like that, where it's high repeat volume really work, is it's the familiarity with load and forming that groove of motor patterns, but also at the same time, they've really overcome that fear of experience. They know what they can do, so they're more likely to go back into it. 5-day splits. This is certainly probably where we're talking about the ultimate end of athletes. Bodybuilders really common, but our gym warriors, they want to come in every night at 5:30 p.m. and do a specific muscle group. They're going to do a shoulders day. If we're writing a program just for a shoulders day, what are the considerations that we might think of in terms of exercise selection and exercise order?
It's already fatigued, just done something up the body the day before, like chest.
Yep, absolutely. So proximity to recent training effects. Did they do chest on Monday, then now coming back to shoulders on Wednesday? If that's the case, have they got shortening of their pec minor or major, which is pulling their shoulder into a slight protraction position? Have they got tricep, did they train arms the night before or the day before, and now they've got a really tight biceps, and it's actually pulling into that subacromial cavity? Have they maybe trained chest and their triceps are heavily fatigued, so they're not going to have as much press strength? And if their triceps are fatigued, typically speaking, where they really need to be involved in press movements, if that's not happening, we tend to get a lot more scapular winging because we go to transfer through that point, it can't handle, and we end up with these people who shrug their way through movements. There's a lot of serious implications of our programming if we're not putting things in the right place. So we need to be thinking absolutely 100% right. What are the previous training effects? Also, what like I talked about before, in terms of exercise order, what's our most dependent exercises on stabilizers. Whatever that is, we need to do them earlier on. Dumbbell shoulder presses, unless we're doing light speed work or sub-max efforts, they need to be done so much earlier in the game. Otherwise, they're just not going to be performed correctly. Or, what's our primary objective? So, for example, if we're working with someone and they've maybe got a goal to become a better weightlifter or become better at weightlifting movements, if we're going to do an overhead barbell press, by going and doing dumbbell shoulder presses, firstly, they're going to have less strength to actually perform what is our primary objective. So, I tend to find a lot of trainers try and incorporate as many exercises, as much variety as possible into that programming, but they're actually now achieving less because they're trying to do too much. Like there's just, yes, awesome, we're hitting all angles, we're hitting different rep ranges, that's great, but we're now achieving nothing because there's no primary objective. So instead, whatever's the most important thing for you and your client to be working on, we'll decide that journey. Sometimes it's as simple as going, all we need to do today is some warm-ups, and then we'll go straight into barbell presses, and then we'll do some light speed work and some mobility work afterwards, and that's it. There's 45 minutes, or there's an hour, there's half an hour, but that was enough because we've maybe incorporated some periodized strength gains with our barbell presses. We'll work on some mobility, perhaps some motor pattern stuff, so making sure that the correct movements are done with maybe some dumbbell shoulder presses afterwards, and done some flexion work to make sure that we've got the right activation of rotator cuffs, the right activation of our surrounding musculature, and the right movement at the joint. That's it. That's three pretty good objectives. We don't need to go through doing a tour of the gym with all the different shoulder machines. And finally, before we finish off as well, when we look at programming considerations for shoulders, it's not going to always be as simple as going from one program to the next where we can build on it. So, if we're looking at, say, legs programming, and let's say we've done a really long block of squats, it's really quite easy to just continue to go, I'm pretty confident last week I could do this, so this week I could do that. So last week may have been 3 sets of 5 and I could do 100 kilos. So this week I'm doing 2 sets of 4. I'm fairly confident I'm going to be able to do at least 3.75 or 5% higher than that, so I'm going to go 105. Shoulders, because they're going to be so impacted by everything else we do. Even if you do deadlifts and you've got really tight traps, or let's say you've been working around the house and you've been moving house and you've overused them by incidental activity, they're going to be really a lot more affected than your other muscle groups. So it's not always going to be as simple as programming and periodizing the way we can on the muscle groups. It's going to be, you've got to take it through the day. And weightlifters certainly teach us that. They'll always go in, and sometimes they will spend an hour warming up because that day they're just not in the groove. There's some things they need to work through. Or you might come in and, if your pecs are too tight, your biceps are too tight, maybe training shoulder today isn't the best idea. Maybe we need to change that plan a little bit. So it's really good to have some goals in mind, to have good programming, good periodization, but be much more flexible and open to the idea of change with shoulders because they're really going to be victim to some of those changes and impacts from other things. And finally as well, confidence with movements. I think, sometimes we get hesitant to stop our clients and just go back to first principles. Shoulders are sometimes one of those things where, especially, let's say we've had someone and they've just gotten really, really strong in bench press. They've got a lot of good core strength. They haven't necessarily had the same progression and development in their posterior exercises, so their bent over rows or their chin-ups or all those things, anything that maybe involves the posterior chain has not developed as well. They're going to now have stronger musculature anterior than they do posterior. It's going to affect their shoulders. Sometimes coming back to first principles and starting again is the best way to move forward because they just need to learn, now that they've got this new strength balance, and it's not necessarily an imbalance, it's just where they're at, but now that they've got this new strength balance, they need to learn again from first principles how to work that movement through that. So, what does it feel like to get my shoulder blades into that posterior tilt position? What does it feel like to retract them now that I've got such stronger pecs that want to pull them forward constantly? How do I have to fight that to, especially if we're talking dumbbell shoulder press, where you start off and you're going to kick them up first off, you start protracted. You know, and then you've got to get them up, and we do our first movement. You know, I don't see anyone correct it. I'm just going to borrow your chair for a second. You know, we don't see anyone often correct it where they kick the first one up and then get back, get in a good retraction position, externally rotate, and then strict press up. Instead, they kick them up, go up, and they're in the worst possible posture, and then they set themselves into that closed chain and then do their reps. So if they've become slightly kyphotic, even if their serratus anterior or their ab rectus are tight, they may even have tight scallions, which is just pulling their neck forward, and now they're going to hurt themselves in an injury because they can't feel what's happening. So really thinking every month, you know, in your programming, you know, have I been compromised in this movement? And it might be as simple as a quick 5-minute refresher on feel this, do this, and yep, now we've got that, let's go into a press. It can be tedious, but you know, if our clients are seeing fantastic improvements in their strength, they're not going to hold us to blame. They're going to be so proud of us and working with us. But you know, we've got to be able to back it to really, really good programming. Any questions, guys?
We have 90 seconds. Do you want to talk about rotation?
Yep. So
if you're throwing a ball, internal rotate on the right arm strong, external rotate on the left arm strong.
Yep. So the question is, talk about rotation if we've got typically a throwing athlete, also people in construction or people with dominant handedness. Let's say we've got an electrician, they always use their drill left-handed. They're going to naturally have stronger shoulder posture there. I don't know if you guys have ever used a rotary drill or a hammer drill, but those things have a lot of torque. They're going to have a lot of strength in that arm, a lot of good control over that, not necessarily the same side. So we get them on something like a dumbbell shoulder press. Certainly in terms of that cross patterning, so one shoulder blade to the next, and dominant pec control, it's going to be a little bit compromised. So easiest way then is going back to the research, using those isokinetic warm-ups, looking at, you know, do they even have the same range? Someone like that, if you know, especially if we're looking, let's talk about the end of that extreme, a baseball pitcher, they're going to have different mobility one arm to the next. That dominant throw arm is actually going to have much more restricted mobility than their free, weaker arm because they're not going to have the shortening of that pec. Or if we're talking construction worker, you know, they may even have different trap development, or if they're a labourer and they're shoveling all day, they're going to have that big drive through one arm and not necessarily the other, because one's going to be an anterior push, the other's going to be a pull. Those things, they're subtle, but over years they actually change the way that people move their body. We get them on a dumbbell shoulder press, they can go left arm fine, right arm can't do anything. So absolutely, the research just suggests correctly in balance, look for that mobility difference, and just start actually working on activation. So as we're doing those things, think about getting the squeeze through the right movements. It can be simple, just jump up for a second, Jake. You know, we're not diagnostic, we're not prescriptive, that's not our capacity as trainers, but you know, if we're doing some simple external rotation, you know, so tuck the elbow in and just think about rotating out, so I want you to be thinking about that. We can get the movement happening, but can we tell them where to squeeze? So when you think about squeezing the line back and holding tight, so we're going to pause. So we can use some little proprioceptive tools to tell our clients where they should be feeling that squeeze, or relax your arm, or if we're doing some retraction work. Oh my god, worst choice. But you know, we can see restrictive movement straight away, and now you're trying to lift that with your deltoid. There's nothing happening there. So we've got no subscap activation making that external rotation happen, so that's why it's clicking. You just want to use the delt. So getting that back to working properly, teaching what should be happening, easiest way to correct that. So rotation dysfunction should be the same as everything else, because the shoulder joint, all the movements it can do, retraction, protraction, your flexion, your extension, all those things it can do are still using the same muscles, just in a different chain of order. So does that make sense? Any other questions, guys? No? Awesome. I will email these studies. So what I might actually do is post them